Today I'm talking to the Right Honourable Tony Benn, one of Britain's foremost socialists and the president of the Stop the War Coalition. Tony Benn, thank you so much for talking to RT. Now, you're a big believer in democracy as the means to pass power from what you call the wallet to the ballot. What do you think is the state of democracy in the world today?
Very imperfect. I mean, if you look at the world, people are beginning to see the world as a single unit. I mean, my granddaughters are at a school in London with 76 nationalities. When I used to go to the school, it was like addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations. And I think that younger generation see the world now as just our local village, and they wonder who governs it, how it can be controlled, how it can be influenced, and so on. And anyone looking at the government of their village or their country or the world is bound to ask themselves, what power do we have over the people who pass the laws? And with the power of big business, which is now enormous going across the world, many big decisions are made by people we didn't elect, cannot remove, and who do not have to listen to us. So it's a very, very big issue, I think.
And you're talking about organisations like the International Monetary Fund.
The European Central Bank and so on and so on. They are instruments of the international power of capital, and they have a huge influence over the government policies in Ireland or Spain or Britain or Greece, and I think that issue is going to become a very big one looking ahead.
And how can we pass the power from the wallet to the ballot?
Well, historically it's been done by people who campaigned for it. I mean, slavery was abolished because people looked at a slave owner flogging a slave and said, who gave him the right to do that to that man? And once you ask the question, who gives him the right to do that, then you've opened up a debate about democracy.
And is that what we're seeing happening now with these protests on the streets of Europe?
Well, I think all demands by people to be heard, sometimes expressing themselves in protest, but otherwise in argument, all these demands are central to the future advance of mankind.
And how has that happened, do you think, that we have gone from being a fairly politically apathetic population, particularly in the UK, to turning out on the streets in huge numbers and shouting about our government?
Well, if you look at it historically, history is a good guide, because if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you are. All great changes have been made by exactly the same type of political campaigning. How did women get the vote? To begin with, you know, there was a very little movement. Then women were determined and they campaigned and they won. How did men get the vote in Britain? How did trade unions get recognised? How did slavery end? There are moments in history when people look round and say, we are being controlled by those who don't have to listen to us, we've got to change it.
Do you support these people who are coming out to protest, sometimes in quite a violent and destructive way?
I very strongly support it, because the right to education is a basic human right. I mean, we now have accepted in Britain and most parts of the world that the right to be educated, the right to health care, the right to peace, to justice are human rights. And if you take some of them away, as they're doing with the university training, you have to pay to go, then you are taking away people's rights and influencing the future of your country.
We seem to be seeing somewhat of a hiatus in the protests at the moment, with Christmas and the New Year coming up. What do you think is going to happen once people recover from their New Year stupor and realise what's going on?
Well, I'm not a forecaster. I'm a journalist forecast the world. I try to influence it. I'm involved in the campaign against the cuts, and I believe it will build up and build up, because I think it is threatening the whole nature of our society. And so I would expect it would have very, very profound political effects in the future.
And as a campaigner, what's your next step going to be?
To bring people together, solidarity, so that students support pensioners who are finding their pensions under some disadvantage. Public servants support those whose benefits are being cut, till the thing becomes a very, very powerful political movement for justice. And once that happens, governments have to listen.
You're a huge supporter of free healthcare for all and of the welfare state in general. We've got figures from the Department of Work and Pensions that say 1.6 million working age people in Britain have never held down a job. Do you think that the welfare state's gone too far?
No. You see, I remember the birth of the welfare state, and it came in this way. I was in the Air Force in the war as a pilot, and I learned to fly in Africa. And in 1943, I went out in a troop ship, and we had thousands of young people. And we decided to have a meeting on war aims. And one young man, I wish I knew his name, but I don't, said this. He said, in the 1930s, we had mass unemployment. He said, we don't have unemployment in wartime. He said, if you can have full employment killing Germans, why can't you have full employment building hospitals, recruiting doctors, recruiting nurses, building schools, building homes? And that was how we got the welfare state. We decided in 1945 to apply the same determination to meet the needs of peace that we had throughout the war applied to meet the needs of war. And I think it wasn't an ideological so much as a practical solution, and it was very incomplete. And the Conservatives in Britain have never really liked it. And the cuts now are a way of finding an excuse for reducing it.
Has it not created a sort of underclass of people who aren't motivated to get a job because they can live fairly comfortably on money from the government?
I don't think so. I mean, there are people who are homeless, and there are people who are not employed, and working class people are at the mercy of those who have the money to employ them. And if you can keep a lot of people unemployed, that is a threat to those at work, because people at work say to themselves, oh well, if I don't accept low wages, my job will go to somebody else. So I don't accept that argument.
And let's go back to democracy more generally. Do you see it as a panacea that can be applied to countries and cultures across the world, no matter what their underlying principles are?
I think whatever country anyone lives in, the demand of people to be heard and have some control is a natural demand. I heard a program in Chinese the other day, which was about a school in China where they agreed to elect the school representative. And it was a fascinating program, because you realize that in that Chinese school, all the characteristics that we associate with voting in Britain were taking place. And then one day, you know, children will say, well, if we could choose our school representative when we were young, why shouldn't we have a role in deciding the government? And I think these things happen, but in order for them to develop, you can't have a threatened society, because a threatened society will repress domestic dissent because they feel it weakens them.
And we went to war in Iraq ostensibly in the name of democracy, but that's obviously not something that you support.
No, I don't think we did. I think we went to war in support of oil interests, and we use arguments, governments use arguments to justify what they do, and then everyone has the right now, with the information at their disposal, to question these arguments and say, are they valid or not? And if they are not valid, why are we doing it? And the Stop the War movement built up the biggest political campaign in Britain in history. There were 2 million people out in London. Didn't actually stop the war, but it created a pattern of public opinion that compelled governments to change their policy.
And since then, have you seen support for what the Stop the War coalition is doing diminish in any way?
No, I think it built up to the point, the maximum point, just when we were going to war. And now, with all the inquiries and thoughts about the war, it isn't the most dominant question. But I think governments realise that when you do get a campaign of that power against what they're doing, they are very vulnerable.
And WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, what do you think that WikiLeaks has done to support your campaign, releasing all this information about the Iraq and Afghan wars?
Well, my opinion is information is itself a very, very powerful weapon. In general, governments want to know everything they can about us. They want to tap our telephone, open our letters to find out what we're doing, and don't want us to know anything about them. And so when all this information is circulating between ambassadors and diplomats without our knowing about it, we are weakened by it. When we know, we're able to put questions and so on. And I think the WikiLeaks is a very, very important event and a very profound one and very relevant to democracy.
And obviously the opposition to WikiLeaks is saying that it puts the soldiers and those who are collaborating with the US and British armies in Afghanistan in danger. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the question is, why should we be in Afghanistan or in Iraq? And that's the question everybody has to answer. Somebody with a story about a young person, and an old man said to him, "Are you interested in politics?" And the boy said no. And so the old man said, "Well, take an interest in politics before politics takes an interest in you, puts you in the army, sends you to Afghanistan." So I think debates about policy are absolutely right.
And let's separate out, if we can, for a moment, the information about the Iraq and Afghan wars that we got from WikiLeaks and then this latest US diplomatic cables that have been released. I would have thought that as an anti-war campaigner, you would support diplomacy by any means as a first and last resort. Doesn't this weaken diplomacy in the world?
No, I think all it does is to reveal the way diplomacy is conducted. But you're quite right, diplomacy is the alternative to war, and therefore if you can get diplomatic contacts going, so much the better. But people are entitled to know what is being done in their name.
But does it really matter what insiders in the diplomatic corps think about presidents' wives and other sort of tittle-tattle?
Well, that's gossip, and gossip you have to disregard, because the politics of gossip makes people cynical. But still, since that happens, you must know it happens, because it helps you to understand better what is really going on among powerful people.
Tony Benn, thank you very much.